Okay, so we're going to move on to our next session, the last session before we have our first coffee break. And I think it moves on really nicely from the conversation we've just had, because one of the issues that came up, I think, from the audience was the issue of trust. And our speakers certainly mentioned the issue of building trust with the public and building trust with our constituents. So in this next session, we're going to hear all about why brand matters for building trust in government. And I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage Paula Scher, who is the partner at Pentagram. Over to you, Paula. Thanks so much.
No, I can't hear me either. You got it? Oh, okay, got turned on. So I'm going to talk a bit about identity design, and I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. This is my dad. He was a photogrammetric engineer who worked for the United States government my whole life. He was a person who was a cartographer and an expert in aerial photography. And he made a computation about how there's lens distortion in aerial photography, and it saved the government billions of dollars in map making. This is a picture of my dad in the middle getting his $1,500 check for a device for which there would be no Google Maps without. Go, Dad. He worked for the government until he was 65. He retired. He was very happy. He loved his life. I wanted to do something else. I became a graphic designer, moved to New York, and landed in the record business in the 70s. And this was an amazing experience because I only had to get one client approval. That has nothing to do with working for the federal government.
Oh.
Later, I left and I started my own business and then joined the international design firm Pentagram and began working on cultural identities and corporate identities and masses of people with approval power, things you know that were influenced by the designs we did, whether it was actually overseeing packaging and determining die lots and things like that, or whether it was installing chains of things that were created. Shake Shack, by the way, was across the street from Pentagram. I did the very first one, and then they were all, I think there are 150 or 200 stores in the world now. And Windows 8. And even something for the government. So, I'm here to talk about what identity is and what branding is, because they're really not exactly the same. Identity design is a function of branding. What a logo is an object that people understand, and it comes from the Greek word logos, which was a word used by Aristotle in sort of his court cases, and what it did is it described a condition of expression of how things were understood to a broad group of people. A logo design is not a brand, it represents a brand. Here's a logo. You all know this one. If you saw the first logo, you wouldn't think much of it, and you wouldn't think much of the sneaker either. If you went through it through history, you saw it in Modernize, Get Stronger, and really the way you saw it was in connection to a specific product that you began to understand in a specific way through coordinated advertisements that were done by the brilliant firm Wieden & Kennedy for 30 years. So when you walk into it today, if you're young, you think it was just an instant sort of creation, but it takes years of time to actually establish a great brand. Apple was the same thing. Look at their first logo, oh my God. I'm old enough to remember Apple Records, which was the Beatles label. They had a really nice half of an apple on their label. It was gorgeous. This looked like junk to me when it first came out. But you began to see the subtlety of it. You begin to realize it's highly recognizable. It's simple. It continues. And the more you look at it in relationship to the product, the more perfect the unity is. Some of that is the companies doing it, and some of it is you doing it. So what is a brand? A brand you cannot necessarily control. It's an amalgamation of everything that everybody sees and understands and knows about something. It can be a person, it can be a product, it can be a service, it can be all of these things, but it's a universal understanding of the way something sort of behaves. For example, the brand Chipotle in New York City was very popular and was everywhere, and then there was food poisoning. They own that. They own that no matter how well they design their logo, because it'll never go away. It becomes part of the understanding of the thing until that understanding is absolved. So here's how identities work, and as I say, they're different from brands. There are really 4 components to getting an identity to be completely understood by a public, and usually the components are this quadrant. And this was invented by Coca-Cola, who were the masters of it. A logo is in the first quadrant. It's unchanging. Packaging could be part of the logo, and packaging may be the building that a company lives in, same sort of thing. Advertising, you understand, and promotions, which are things that move faster. These 3 things move through different time sequences, and they get faster every year. Here's Coca-Cola's quadrant. Their first logo was designed in the 1800s, and it was dramatically different. And somewhere around the early 1900s, they figured out who they were. Then you'll see there's actually very little change over a very long period of time, which is rather amazing. They settled on their red. They stayed with it forever, and they run a constant cycle of this.
Or the glasses.
And you recognize it, and you know it immediately.
Glasses in the other room, not in this one.
Tiffany, who I worked for, had blue for a long time. What they didn't have was one blue because it was really more of a production problem. It was printed in about 17 different places, and no printer matched the blue the same way. So what we did is created a special dye lot and put one in the US and another one in Asia, and the papers are only printed in one place, and that makes the consistency of it. We also did something really bizarre. We reduced their logo so it was very small. No one asks me to do that anymore. But you recognize it, and you notice even within their promotion cycle, the stuff is very much the same. Apple has a very clear hierarchy. Their logo, their packaging doesn't necessarily display the logo prominently. The advertising has the logo small, but the product big. And then the promotion is all over the map. It can be an event, a place, an idea, and it changes radically each time, and they're allowed to do it because of who they are. Here's how people actually look and see and understand logos. These are a whole pile of logos that I know all of you know, and this is what they looked like about 12 years ago. This is what they look like now, except Twitter, which is X. However, what's happened is that social media did this, and social media drastically changed the way America sees things. They recognize things very quickly and understand them, and they can actually define something just by looking at a little mark like that.
43 of 87.
The United States has 3 letters, USA. And here are logos that have 3 letters. They're a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit harder to recognize, but in most instances are recognizable when you're really familiar with the product.
You started a bit late, so...
So here's what we discovered about our government branding. These are high-impact service provider websites. They're so described because most people go to these. And originally, when the government contacted me, it was not to design a logo for the United States. It was really to design a logo for the website USA.gov. But it was quickly discovered when we did the research that only 6% of Americans go to USA.gov when they want to find out something that they need. Mostly what they do is they go to Google, and they type in the name of the place they want to talk to, whether it's Medicare or it's Social Security or it's the IRS, and it's usually one of the big ones that you would logically assume they would want to talk to. And they get sent to one of these websites. Now, sometimes, what's interesting about these websites is these are all different divisions of government. Each one of these is an individual site. They're not the same, but they're not very different. So they sort of look the same. So if you go on, say, the IRS and you get sent to the Department of Treasury, it looks slightly different. Not different enough so you notice, oh, wow, that's a different website. It's different enough to think you might be having somebody steal money from you. And this is a real problem. This is a real problem because this is how people operate and shop, and that they can be very easily taken in by any bad actor in the business. So the public lacks a clear and consistent way to know when they're interacting with the US government, especially online, and you can see it right there in those websites. It enables fraud, scams against the American people from for-profit actors selling government services to the public, and it's dangerous. Here are other instances that don't have any kind of marking on it that represents the United States government. They have departments on them, different divisions, because really what the United States government represents itself as is a series of sub-brands. They're not one branded entity. And that's dangerous because sub-brands often go off on their own little directions and become brands. And that's actually bad for government communication. So we were assigned with a task of designing a logo that said USA and putting it on stuff. Now, currently, there's a little American flag that sits and says this is a government website. It's very small, and it also looks a little bit fake because it's just like, it looks like a little flag pin that somebody took a picture of. Here's what United States logos look like, not for the United States government, but for all kinds of commercial activities. Does this look familiar to you? It's sport, somebody selling socks. It's a pile of stuff, and it's patriotic. A lot of it was designed for holidays and sales. Is this not moving? Here's a little more of it, clearer. And we had to stay away from something like this because ultimately it doesn't look like it's government. It looks like it's commercial. So we developed potential designs from government, and we started by talking to everybody we could within GSA and at OMB about what their desires were for a government brand. And here's what people said: that it should be somewhat patriotic, that it shouldn't be too patriotic, that it should be something that it looks like it's for the public. It's got to be able to talk to a lot of people. I can't read these from here, but you can probably read them better. Then we began designing these logos, and we began to play around with letter forms. This is just a normal exercise of being a graphic designer, looking at things in different weights and sizes, even before you begin to put in color. Some things look more contemporary, some things look boring, some things look like they would be too heavy, some things look like they'd be too light, some things got too wide and goofy. There was all kinds of stuff we looked at, and then when you put it into a color system, it looked much different. It looked its worst when the corners were rounded. We did about 1,000 of these in our studio, and we just began eliminating until we felt we could pull things that would make reasonable presentations. I'm just showing you this to bore you a little. And then we got to color. And all of a sudden, they started to begin to look like logos. And a lot of these, not all of them, were taken out and put into a series of tests with people responding their likes and their dislikes. There were sort of two that everybody liked. One was lowercase and one was uppercase. And here's where we left off. This was sort of selected by a group, but not finalized, and the reason I think it was probably selected was because it looks serious, it looks important, it represents the United States in a fair way with a very powerful U and A holding together a curvy S, and if you think about the structure of government in the states versus the whole entity, I think that's appropriate, and we'll move on from here. Thank you.
We've got 5 minutes left, so thank you so much for that presentation, Paula. Fascinating to see the process of how you get there and really building on those issues of trust and the importance of communicating to the public. I'm sure there are questions to Paula. When we do logos in the civil service in the UK, it gets more questions than anything else, I think, logos and branding. Who would like to ask Paula any questions at all about branding?
There's a woman right
Yes. Question. And then we can get another mic down here. There's a lady at the front with a question as well.
Thank you. So I'm Abby Bowman. I work at NASA. So obviously we have a long history of a very strong brand and identity. And when the U.S.
Dick Daney.
Yes. When the U.S. web design system came out, right, we were very excited about improving public trust by standardizing these design elements. And that was such a kind of light bulb moment for me when you were talking of sometimes increasing conformity decreases public trust because now we're losing that strong identity at the agency level. So how would you recommend we thread that needle of enough conformity, right, to establish trust at the government level without losing our trust at the agency level?
Yeah, this is the problem in a nutshell, actually. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that the individual departments of government are very forcefully proud of their seals and their identity, and they show them quite visibly. And that they have nothing that tells you that you're in the United States government first. The sub-brand is coming before the brand, in a sense, is what government's doing. And that with people who are working for, say, the Treasury Department or with the Treasury Department, and they're there all the time and they're looking at it, that's terrific. But if you don't know that the IRS is connected to that and you're transferred, then you're completely confused. And that the understanding of the human behavior, I don't think, is being communicated effectively enough to the broader groups who just seem to rebuff it. They really don't want to go there. And that's good for them, but not necessarily good for the audience.
Thanks. Great question. And we've got your colleague, the CIO from NASA, on one of the sessions after the break, talking about developing websites that build trust. So really good segue there. Yes, can we get the microphone down here? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cass Olson, recovering visual designer and current service delivery designer with the U.S. Digital Service. So understanding we have things and tools like the U.S. web design system, which is awesome, but this may be a stumper of a question. How do you square the visibility or sort of the ethos of all of these different agencies that may see themselves as a compliance organization or an oversight body, as opposed to one that sees itself in perhaps a more service-minded or service delivery position? I think you see that a lot between, hey, we are writing the rules versus we are delivering the products and services. Any advice through how brand might help that?
Well, I think that you have to do an overall brand study of how all the different various services connect. For example, Medicare is not a division of government, it's a part of another branch. And yet it's maybe one of the most trafficked websites. So if you're looking at it from a customer point of view, and you have to say, okay, you're not in business, but these are your customers. They're people who are coming to get the services from the government. You have to have that sort of an awareness about it, which is what commercial businesses do, or they go out of business. And that you need that kind of analysis to say, okay, here's where people are going, here's where this thing is necessary, and still it's necessary to create various hierarchies that, yes, this is an agency of, et cetera. But that's a branding exercise. and a very typical one, actually, because it's necessary and it's going to help you communicate to your audiences. Does that make sense?
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes left, so I've got 2 questions here. We'll take both, Paula, and if that's all right, and then you can answer both.
Hi, my name is Paul Scott. I'm from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Great discussion, and we all know that CX and reaching out to our customers and clients, all of us, many of us from the federal government, we know that's increasingly important. My question is, recognizing some of the tension that we have generally in our country, the changes, increasingly diversity, north, south, rural, our urban areas, all of those things that come into play. How does, I'm just curious how does that come into play in dealing with logos and branding and things of that sort, especially at a federal agency, because you want to have something that's, again, authoritative, some type of standardization, but again, because we want to make sure that our products and the services that we're providing can reach those clients out there. And so I'd just like to get your perspective and your response on that.
Thank you. I'm going to take the second question as well, just because of timing.
Okay,
if
so I have
that's
to
all
remember
right.
his
So,
question. Right.
Great question on how do you make sure it's as inclusive as possible. Yep.
Hi, Lacey Ramos, also a former visual designer, now a UX researcher and designer with United States Digital Corps. You mentioned earlier USA.gov, and I've also looked at government from a branding standpoint. Do you feel that having a single front door to the US government, like USA.gov or login.gov, is a good idea with the variety that you were mentioning earlier? And also, do you feel that those websites like USA.gov should be promoted?
Thank you.
That's an interesting question. And I have to remember the first one, so I've got to go back. The thing that you're raising requires a lot of testing, because you have to see why and how people are going there. You need it. It's not heavily trafficked, and it's probably not heavily trafficked because people understand that they can just find out exactly where they want to go without going through this and having to read whatever announcements are there to find their information. And that's always going to be an issue, because you can. And I don't think people should be forced to go through the front door, but if you want to find out other things about government and other services that are provided, that's a good place to go. So maybe that needs a little promotion of sorts, and then maybe the other things need to be able to operate more efficiently. And can you please restate, there was a crux to your question and I forgot what it was.
It was the how inclusive, how do you make sure
the
that what you
inclusivity,
yeah.
that's right. That's very much what goes on in private enterprise. In other words, what most people do in companies is they test. They find out what is needed and wanted by people in a specific marketplace or a specific area or a specific income, and figure out how they're going to design and create products that can appeal to those people. Sometimes it's regional. Mostly what I've experienced is really about price. You know, like sort of what price range is it in, and who is the audience that's buying that, and what is the expectation, and how do you actually get it, that sort of thing. The stores, what are the store signages like, what are the parking lots like, et cetera, so that there are other factors that weigh into it if it's not virtual. Virtual websites are tested all the time. I mean, people are always looking for traffic and what the hits are, and they redesign them in relationship to that. And so that might be the way to start on the digital landscape with some market research and figure out if something's working better in one region than another.
Paula, thank you so much. Sadly, we are out of time, but I think everybody's going to go away now and look at their website and compare it to other people's websites. So thank you so much. Please join me in giving Paula a very warm round of applause. Thank you so much, Paula.